Hello, my name is Karen Hans. I'm a fish biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm here to talk to you about watershed processes and about geofluvial morphological process. What? Geofluvial morphological process? What is that? Well, if you break it down into its root words, you can figure it out. Geo means earth. Fluvial means by a river. And morphological means change, like a tadpole changing into a frog. So when I say fluvial means by a river, I don't mean next to it. I mean the forces by which a river works. And so geofluvial morphological process means how the earth is changed by water. Now, this is a scale model of a watershed. And a watershed is a part of the earth where when the rain falls, it hits the land and it runs always downhill, always by the course of least resistance, and it settles into a creek or a river, and that is what the watershed is named for. So here, I'm in the Spring Creek watershed. Spring Creek goes into the Willamette River, so I'm also in the Willamette River watershed. And the Willamette River goes into the Columbia River, so I am also in the Columbia River watershed. So watersheds can be relatively small, like the land just right around me here, or they can be very large. The Columbia River covers 5 states, 2 countries, and tens of thousands of square miles. Now, what I have here is what we would call a properly functioning watershed. Now, what I mean by that is that as the water moves down the creek, it comes into these log jams, and it creates really good habitat for fish and aquatic animals like salamanders and snakes and the macroinvertebrates and aquatic insects that live in the creek. Now, geofluvial morphological processes happen very slowly, over tens of thousands, even millions of years, just an inch at a time. And then they're punctuated by these really enormous dynamic stochastic events. Now, stochastic is a really awesome word that means a random environmental trauma, or what we might call a natural disaster. So the watershed will build up, the soil will build up on the mountain very slowly over time, the trees will grow, the rivers will form, and then there'll be a massive fire, a flood, an earthquake, or a volcano that will dramatically alter the watershed. And so watersheds form through both a combination of these very slow geofluvial morphological processes punctuated by these stochastic events. So a properly functioning watershed has a lot of these log jams in it. And these log jams function to provide a lot of habitat, especially for fish. Now, as the water moves down the river, it's following the course of least resistance, and it develops into this twisting, turning pattern, what we call sinuous. Now, the sinuosity of the river creates these places where logs will jam and build up. Now, these are really important to fish because in the wintertime, when it's flooding and the water is moving really swiftly, the fish need a place to hide. You see, to a fish, a flood is kind of like a hurricane. And when there's a hurricane, we go inside. And so that's what the fish do. These log jams are kind of like a fish house. And so when the water is coming down this river really, really fast with a really strong force, the fish aren't out here in the middle of the current, they're down here hiding in these log jams to get out of that really strong flow, just like we would go inside to get out of a hurricane. Now, the other thing that happens in the wintertime that's really important and what makes this watershed properly functioning is it's connected to its floodplain. Now, the floodplain is this area out here in the middle between these two rivers. And when the water comes up and it spreads out across the floodplain, the fish go with it. And they swim out into what is normally the land where they can't go. And all those terrestrial insects and worms and bugs and slugs float up into the water, and the fish move out and they eat all that food, and then as the water goes back down again, their instinct tells them to follow that flow back to the river. They'll feel the flow, they'll hear it, and their instinct will tell them, go back to the river. So that's why these log jams are so important to fish in the wintertime. But in the summertime, they're also really important because they create pools of cold water. Because fish need water 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And so when summer comes and early fall and it hasn't been raining for a very long time, the fish still need water. Now, what happens is as the water comes down during that flood, these log jams will create what we call scour pools. And they're places up above and below the log jam and underneath the log jam where the pool forms. And the other thing that happens is as the water is flooding, it's pushing gravel along and rocks. And as that happens, those gravels and those rocks roll downstream. Now, when they get to this log jam, it slows down the water and it creates a gravel bar where all those gravels fall out of the flowing water. The reason that is so important is because in the summertime, when the water flows through that gravel and into that pool, it cools off very dramatically between 5-6 degrees Celsius. So the water up here might be 70 degrees, but it goes down underneath the gravel and comes out in the deep pool under the log jam, it can be 5 or 6 degrees cooler than that. So, the other thing about this properly functioning watershed is there's a lot of debris, and when this floats downstream, it collects in the log jams, and that can provide habitat for salamanders and frogs in the summertime, because these debris will retain moisture and keep a nice, cool, wet place for those amphibians and reptiles that need that moist environment. And with all properly functioning watersheds, down here in the bottom of the valley, we have a beaver dam. Now, beavers are really important to the ecosystem. So important that we call them a keystone species. Now, that means that the beavers are so important to all the other animals and plants, all the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the cattails and the willows that grow in that marsh and live in that marsh. They're so important that if the beaver disappears, the whole ecosystem is in danger of collapse. And when we have a species that's so important, we call it a keystone species. Now, when the beaver builds this dam, they do it for protection from predators so that they can get under the water and into their lodge if there's a cougar or a coyote after them. But when they do that, they build this impounded, ponded area, and that provides the water for the fish and the birds and the amphibians and the reptiles and all those trees and plants like the cattails and the willows that need that wet environment. The other thing it does is it builds up and charges, we call it charging the groundwater. So as it backs up here, it soaks into the soil and then it slowly flows out of the groundwater. And just like the water going through the gravels upstream, that groundwater from the marsh around the Beaver Dam is cold. So as the summer drags on and the water in the upper parts of the watershed and the flows get lower and lower, the fish and the other aquatic animals will move downstream into this Beaver Dam where they will spend the summer drier months. So I'm going to turn on the water to make it rain so that you can see how this properly functioning watershed will work. Now as the water goes down through the river channel, and it starts to carry the debris with it, and that's a good thing. And now it flows out, it hits that log jam and immediately goes out onto the floodplain. And it's carrying the sediment, the rocks, the gravel, the debris downstream with it. It hits the Beaver Dam. Now the Beaver Dam's not going to stop the water. It's just going to slow it down because there's still going to be fish downstream. Now, as the summer drags on and the water flows downstream, and up here in the upper parts of the watershed, it gets lower and lower and warmer and warmer. And, but where all these log jams are, you're going to have a pool and you're going to have a gravel bar. And as a fish biologist, I might be doing a river survey and I'll be walking down a river that I may be ankle deep in water. There might not be any water at all. It might be completely under the gravel bar. And I'll step into that log jam and I'll be waist deep in water. I mean, they really are significant. And I can feel the difference in the water temperature in my feet. I can feel that the water is colder. And so now let's say this is September and we still have a lot of water in the Beaver Dam, and there's still some flowing here down this other side. Now maybe this channel here has gone dry, but look, up here underneath this log jam, there's still water. In here, there's still water. And that's where the fish are going to be. And so this is what has occurred over thousands of years. The trees grew, they fell, they formed log jams, they washed away, new trees grew and fell. And this is a watershed that is really good for fish. It's really good for wildlife. It's good for the amphibians like the red-legged frogs and the Pacific giant salamanders. Down here in the beaver marsh, you're going to have ducks and grebes and herons, muskrats, aquatic garter snakes. But this is not what our watersheds look like now. I'm here in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, but this is true for many places, not just around America, but around the world. And before I start talking about what happened, I want to say that I don't blame the people who changed our watersheds. because they didn't know any better. They didn't know about watershed process. They didn't know about geofluvial morphological process. And so they did what they thought was best at the time. So I don't fault them for what they did. And here in the Willamette Valley, it all started in 1806 when Lewis and Clark returned from their long journey and told the people that there was this wonderful place called the Willamette Valley and Oregon, and there was lots and lots and lots of beavers. Well, beavers were very, very valuable at that time because men wore hats made from beaver pelts. And so the trappers came out in the 1820s and the 1830s, and they trapped out all the beavers. And then the pioneers came. And once again, I don't fault them for what they did, because they came into the Willamette Valley in the 1840s and 50s and 60s in a Calistoga wagon with a few cattle, a sack of flour, their shirt on their back. And they had to survive. And there was no grocery stores or schools or hospitals or towns or cities. Then they had to build them, and they had to grow crops. And you just didn't need to grow enough food to eat. You needed to grow enough food to sell, to support yourself. And so they did what they thought was best. And one of the things they needed to do was use the rivers for roads. And that was how they got their crops to market. Well, there used to be a log jam like this. There used to be 50 for every mile of river. And it made it very difficult to move your apples in a raft. So one of the first things they did was they took out the log jams so they could use the rivers for roads. And then they needed the trees to build their homes and their towns or schools. And they didn't have excavators and chainsaws and log trucks and skidders. They had a pair of ox and a crosscut saw. So they had to take the trees that were closest to the creeks, and they had to use the rivers to transport the trees to the mills. And so they cut down all the trees that were closest to the rivers, and that removed a lot of the trees that provided the shade that kept the water cool, and it took out the trees that would provide the future logs for the log jams. So then they came into these fertile valleys, and one of the reasons that their crops grew so well was because every year it would flood, and it would bring this nutrient-rich soil to the floodplain. And so they found that the soil was very, very rich, and their crops grew really, really well. But the problem was it flooded every year. And flooding is very scary. It washes away your home. It washes away your cattle and your horses. It washes away your barn. It washes you away. It washes away your children. And they wanted to stop the flooding, and they wanted to use that valley, as much of that valley as they could, for their crops. So they wanted the water to leave the valley as quickly as possible. So they thought what they would do is they would take this valley with 2 creek channels coming down off the mountain, and they would send all of the water down one channel. And they would dig out all the twists and the turns so that the water would go really fast. And every time there would be a lot of rain or the snow would melt, that water would just wash down the valley. And then they filled in this other channel so that they could farm it. Well, what ended up happening was that the water that used to go into two channels was now all going down one channel. And the force of that water kept washing everything away because there was no log jams or big rocks to slow it down. And so the channel got deeper and deeper, and it washed away all the logs that fell in, and it washed away all the gravels that cooled the water, created the pools, and it washed away all the gravels that the fish spawned in, and it washed away all the gravels that the fish's food, the insects, lived in, and it washed away the gravels that all the little fish lived in, and it washed away all the aquatic life in the river. So now I'm going to make it rain so you can see the difference in this channel and how it is no longer functioning, what we would call a properly functioning channel, in terms of providing habitat for fish and wildlife. And remember, there's no beaver dam here either to hold the water back in the summer. It's also disconnected the creek from its floodplain. So the water is no longer flooding out onto the floodplain the way it used to. And you can see how much quicker it made it down to the drain, just a matter of seconds. And then when the water shuts off in the early summer and it starts to drain out, and the whole notion was that the water would drain out as quickly as possible and wash away as quickly as possible. In addition to being a problem for the fish and the aquatic life, it worked out it wasn't too good for the people either, because for one thing, all this water washed downstream and flooded the people who lived down the river, down in the bottom of the valley. And the other thing that happened was the valley was no longer charged every year, if you will. The groundwater and the nutrients from the soil were no longer flowing out over the floodplain and recharging the groundwater. The beaver marsh was gone that recharged the groundwater. And so for the farmers that were in the valley, their soil quality, the fertile soil started to lose its nutrients. And over time, they had to start adding fertilizer. And then over time, their wells began to go dry in the summer. And so, because the groundwater wasn't being held back by the floodplain and the beaver marsh. And so this is what many of the watersheds in the Willamette Valley and other places in the world look like now. And as a fish biologist, my job is to take care of fish. And one of the ways that I do that is by trying to restore these functioning rivers by putting back log jams back into the creek, for example. And the way that often happens is I'll get a phone call from someone, and she will tell me how, she'll say, Karen, when I was a little girl and I used to go visit my grandma on her farm, and we would go fishing in the creek, and it's some of my very happiest memories. And now the farm is mine, and I have a granddaughter, but there's no fish in that creek anymore. And what do I need to do to get the fish back? And so I will go to her farm, and I will talk to her about geofluvial morphological process and the importance of log jams. And I will talk to her about how to get log jams back into that river and restore the natural process of the river so that the fish will return.